The thunder of cannons shakes the ground as smoke blots out the sun. This is Waterloo, a name etched into history, a battle so famous it's become shorthand for decisive moments. Napoleon's final stand, the charge of the Old Guard, the Iron Duke's triumph, every detail feels familiar, almost mythic. But what if I told you that for every Waterloo, there are a dozen battles just as pivotal, just as dramatic, that history has quietly forgotten? Wars aren't just made of the clashes we remember, they're shaped by the ones we've overlooked. Picture this, a battlefield where the fate of empires hung in the balance, where courage and strategy collided in ways that changed the world, only for the story to vanish from textbooks, erased by time or overshadowed by grander narratives. These forgotten battles aren't just footnotes, they're missing puzzle pieces in our understanding of history. Some were turning points that altered borders, some introduced tactics still used today, and others were simply so brutal or bizarre that they defy belief. Yet they've slipped through the cracks, buried under the weight of more famous names. Today, we're uncovering 25 of these lost clashes battles that deserve to be remembered. From ancient sieges where defenders held out against impossible odds to medieval melees that decided the rise of dynasties, these are the fights that shaped our world but never got their due. Why were they forgotten? Sometimes it was politics, sometimes propaganda, or just the cruel passage of time. But their echoes are still with us, hidden in plain sight. So join me as we step off the well-trodden path of history and into the shadows, where the echoes of these forgotten battles still whisper their stories, waiting at last to be heard. The Roman Republic was at the height of its power. Its legions feared across the Mediterranean until an autumn day in 105 BCE, when disaster struck near the town of Arausio. Two massive Roman armies, led by the consuls Gnaeus Mallius Maximus and Quintus Servilius Scipio, faced off against a horde of migrating Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutones. What followed wasn't just a defeat, it was annihilation. The Roman forces, torn apart by infighting and arrogance, were surrounded and slaughtered. Ancient historians claimed losses as high as 80,000 soldiers, a staggering number even by the standards of ancient warfare. If the name Arausio doesn't ring a bell, that's the tragedy of it. This was Rome's worst military disaster before Cannae, yet it barely gets a footnote in most history books. So what went wrong? The battle was a perfect storm of Roman hubris and tribal ferocity. The two consuls, locked in bitter rivalry, refused to coordinate their forces. Scipio, a patrician, scorned Mallius Maximus for his lower birth and even sabotaged his command. Meanwhile, the Cimbri and Teutones, hardened by years of migration, fought with terrifying cohesion. When the tribes attacked, the divided Roman lines crumbled. Retreating troops found themselves trapped against the Rhone River, their escape cut off. The river ran red with Roman blood, yet Arausio's real legacy wasn't just the scale of the defeat, it was the shockwaves it sent through Rome. The disaster forced the Republic to confront its crumbling military structure. Out of the ashes came Gaius Marius, the general who would revolutionize Rome's armies, abandoning the old aristocratic system for a professional, merit-based force. His reforms laid the groundwork for the imperial legions that would later dominate the ancient world. So why does Arausio languish in obscurity? Blame Cannae. Hannibal's victory just over a century later became the ultimate shorthand for Roman calamity, its drama eclipsing Arausio's raw brutality. But without Arausio, there might have been no Marius, no reformed legions, and perhaps no Roman Empire. It's a battle that reshaped history, then vanished from it. The wind howled across the open plains of Gaul in the year 451, carrying with it the weight of an empire's desperate gamble. Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, had turned his gaze westward, his vast horde a storm of hooves and steel, sweeping toward the heart of what remained of Roman power. But waiting for him near the Catalonian plains was an unlikely alliance. the aging Roman general Flavius Aetius and his Visigothic rival turned ally King Theodoric. This wasn't just a battle, it was a collision of worlds, a last stand that would determine whether Europe bent to the will of the Huns or held firm. Attila's reputation alone was enough to send shivers through seasoned soldiers. His warriors had carved a path of destruction from the steppes of Central Asia to the gates of Constantinople. Now, with Rome weakened by internal strife, he saw his chance to claim Gaul and beyond. But Aetius, a brilliant strategist who'd once been a hostage of the Huns, understood their tactics better than any Roman alive. He knew brute force wouldn't be enough. So he did the unthinkable. He convinced the Visigoths, longtime foes of Rome, to fight alongside him. Theodoric, though wary, recognized the greater threat. Together, their combined forces formed a fragile wall against the Hunnic tide. The battle itself was chaos incarnate. Ancient chronicles describe a field so choked with bodies that the dead stood upright, propped up by the press of combat. Theodoric was killed early, crushed beneath his own cavalry, but his son Thorismund rallied the Visigoths with a vengeance. Attila, fearing capture, retreated to his wagon fortress, reportedly preparing a funeral pyre, ready to burn himself alive rather than be taken. Yet in a twist of fate, Aetius chose not to press the attack. Some say he wanted to keep the Huns as a counterbalance to the Visigoths' growing power. Others argue his forces were too spent to finish the job. Whatever the reason, Attila survived, but his aura of invincibility didn't. Why does this battle, one of the largest and bloodiest of the ancient world, slip through the cracks? Part of the answer lies in the fractured nature of the era. The Western Roman Empire was in its death throes, and chroniclers were more preoccupied with its collapse than with battles that merely delayed the inevitable. Yet the Catalonian plains mattered. It was the first time Attila had been checked in open combat, and though he'd raid Italy the next year, his momentum was broken. The Hunnic Empire fractured after his death, sparing Western Europe from further devastation. Here's the real irony: the battle's obscurity might also stem from its messy aftermath. There was no clean victory, no heroic last stand, just a grim stalemate soaked in blood. History loves clear narratives, and the Catalonian plains refuses to fit neatly into one. But without it, the map of Europe might look very different. This was the battle that bought time for new kingdoms to rise from Rome's ashes, time for a future that didn't belong to Attila. And that's a story worth remembering. East of the fabled Silk Road, where empires brushed against one another in a vast, contested landscape, two of history's mightiest powers collided in a battle few today even recognize. The year was 751, and the setting was the Talas River, a name now forgotten by most, but one that marked the moment when Chinese and Islamic civilizations clashed for supremacy in Central Asia. On one side stood the Tang dynasty's formidable army, a force that had pushed China's borders further west than ever before. Arrayed against them was the rising power of the Abbasid Caliphate, fresh from its overthrow of the Umayyads and hungry to expand its influence. What made Talas extraordinary wasn't just the scale, though tens of thousands fought, but the ripple effects that reshaped the world in ways still felt today. The battle hinged on betrayal. The Tang forces, led by General Gao Xianji, relied heavily on their Karluk Turk allies, but mid-battle, the Karluks switched sides, encircling the Chinese troops and sealing their defeat. The Abbasid victory didn't just stop Chinese expansion. It marked the beginning of Islam's dominance in Central Asia, a cultural shift that endures. Yet Talas' greatest legacy might be what it accidentally spread rather than what it destroyed. Among the Chinese prisoners taken by the Abbasids were skilled papermakers. Their techniques soon revolutionized the Islamic world, reaching Baghdad's House of Wisdom and later Europe, fueling an intellectual awakening. Paper, not war, became the battle's lasting gift to history. So why is Talas so often overlooked? Blame the lens through which history gets written. European chroniclers, fixated on their own conflicts, paid little attention to this distant showdown. Chinese records, stung by defeat, minimized its significance. Even the Abbasids, flush with victory, saw it as just one frontier skirmish in a vast empire. But the truth is, Tollers quietly redrew the map. Without it, Central Asia might have remained a Chinese sphere. Papermaking could have taken centuries longer to reach the West, and the balance between Islam and Buddhism in the region could have tipped very differently. A forgotten battle, perhaps, but one that quietly shaped the world we know. The sun-baked hills of Syria bore witness in the year 636 to a clash that would echo across centuries, the Battle of Yarmouk, where the fledgling forces of Islam shattered Byzantium's grip on the Levant. Imagine an empire at its twilight. Byzantium, heir to Rome's eastern glory, still commanded vast armies and towering fortresses. Yet over 6 grueling days, a smaller, mobile force of Rashidun Caliphate warriors outmaneuvered and outfought them, securing a victory that would redraw the map of the ancient world. This wasn't just a battle, it was the moment the Middle East pivoted toward a new destiny. What made Yarmouk so extraordinary wasn't just the tactical brilliance of Muslim generals like Khalid ibn al-Walid, though his maneuvers seizing water sources, feigning retreats to lure Byzantine troops into traps, were masterful. It was the sheer stakes. Byzantium's Emperor Heraclius had thrown everything into this fight, assembling a force of Greeks, Armenians, and Arab Christian allies to crush the upstart Islamic expansion. But the Rashidun army, united by faith and fighting for a cause they believed divine, turned the terrain itself into a weapon. Sandstorms blinded Byzantine lines at critical moments, while the Muslims' lighter armor allowed them to strike and retreat with deadly efficiency. By the battle's end, Byzantium's losses were catastrophic. Some sources claim over 40,000 dead, a blow from which the empire never fully recovered in the region. Yet for all its earth-shaking consequences, Yarmouk remains oddly absent from popular medieval narratives. Why blame the spotlight hogged by later crusades? Western chroniclers, obsessed with clashes between Christendom and Islam in the 11th century onward, often skipped the earlier, more decisive encounters. Even Byzantine historians, perhaps embarrassed by the scale of their defeat, glossed over Yarmouk's details, but the battle's legacy is undeniable. Within years of the victory, Damascus and Jerusalem fell. The Levant became the heartland of a new Islamic civilization, while Byzantium retreated into a slow decline. Trade routes, languages, even architectural styles shifted under the new order. Here's what's most striking. Yarmouk didn't just change who ruled the land, it reshaped how people lived. The tolerant policies of early Muslim rulers allowed Christians and Jews to retain their faith under protection, fostering a multicultural society that would later produce scholars, scientists, and philosophers who fueled the golden age of Islam. The battle's true impact wasn't just territorial, it was cultural, and that's why its obscurity is so baffling. We remember Hastings or Tours, yet Yarmouk, a hinge point between antiquity and the medieval world, slips through the cracks. Perhaps because history prefers clear-cut heroes and villains, and Yarmouk's story is one of adaptation, not annihilation. But in the quiet aftermath of those 6 bloody days, the seeds of a new world were sown. The dense forests of the Balkan Mountains held their breath in the summer of 811. As Byzantine Emperor Nikephoros I led an army of 60,000 men, the finest soldiers Constantinople could muster, deep into Bulgar territory. This wasn't just a campaign, it was meant to be a crushing display of imperial might, a lesson to the upstart Khan Krum and his Bulgar warriors, but history had other plans. What unfolded near Pliska wasn't a victory march, it was a slaughter so complete, so devastating, that it left an empire humiliated and a ruler's skull transformed into a drinking cup. Nikephoros, confident in his overwhelming numbers, made fatal errors from the start. He dismissed the Bulgars' guerrilla tactics, assuming their scattered retreats signaled weakness. But Khan Krum, a master of asymmetric warfare, had lured the Byzantines into a death trap. As the imperial army advanced toward Pliska, the Bulgars burned their own crops and poisoned wells, leaving the invaders hungry and exposed. Then, in the mountain passes near Varbitsa, Krum sprung his ambush. Log barriers sealed the narrow paths, while Bulgar warriors rained arrows and spears from the cliffs above. The Byzantines, packed tightly in the ravines, couldn't advance or retreat. Panic spread like wildfire. Nikephoros, realizing his doom too late, was among the first cut down. The aftermath was as brutal as the battle itself. Chronicles describe Bulgar warriors piling Byzantine corpses into pyramids, a grisly monument to their triumph. Nikephoros' skull, stripped of flesh and lined with silver, became Krum's trophy, a macabre symbol of Bulgar defiance. But Pliska's true impact wasn't just in its bloodshed. It shattered Byzantine prestige, emboldening the Bulgars to push deeper into imperial territory. Within 2 years, Krum stood before the walls of Constantinople itself, threatening the heart of the empire. So why does Pliska linger in obscurity, blame geography and the selective memory of history? The Balkans, often treated as Europe's periphery, rarely get the spotlight afforded to clashes in France or Italy. Yet Pliska reshaped the region's destiny. It cemented the First Bulgarian Empire as a regional power, forcing Byzantium to treat its northern neighbor as an equal. The peace treaty that eventually followed recognized Bulgar sovereignty, a rare concession wrung from Constantinople at sword point. Here's what's often missed: Pliska wasn't just a military catastrophe. It exposed the fragility of imperial power. The Bulgars, once seen as barbarians, proved they could outthink and outfight a superpower. Their victory echoed through centuries, influencing the cultural and political DNA of the Balkans. Yet while history remembers the Crusades or Viking raids, Pliska, a battle that altered the balance of a continent, fades into the shadows, perhaps because empires prefer to forget their failures. But the mountains of Bulgaria haven't forgotten. The wind still whispers through Varbitsa Pass, carrying echoes of the day an emperor fell and an empire learned the price of arrogance. The plains of Lechfeld in 955 bore witness to a battle that didn't just change a kingdom, it midwifed a nation. For decades, the Magyars had terrorized Europe, their lightning-fast cavalry raiding deep into Bavaria, Italy, and even as far as Spain. These weren't mere skirmishes, they were existential threats, leaving monasteries in ashes and nobles trembling behind castle walls. Then came Otto the Great, a Saxon king with a vision of unity and an iron will to match. What unfolded that August wasn't just a military victory, it was the moment Germany began to coalesce from the fractured chaos of medieval Europe. Otto's genius lay in preparation. Unlike previous rulers who'd chased the Magyars in vain, he studied their tactics. He knew their strength was mobility, so he denied it to them. Drawing them toward Augsburg, he positioned his heavy cavalry and dismounted knights on broken terrain where Magyar horsemen couldn't maneuver. When the Magyars attacked, confident after years of easy plunder, they found Otto's forces disciplined and ready. The battle turned into a slaughter. Trapped between Otto's main force and a surprise flanking attack led by Duke Conrad the Red, the Magyars were annihilated. Those who fled were hunted down by local peasants. So thorough was their defeat that Magyar raids into Europe ceased overnight. But Lechfeld's true legacy wasn't just safety, it was identity. Otto's victory proved that the Germanic tribes could unite against a common foe. Within years, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, laying the foundation for a state that would endure for nearly a millennium. Historians often call this the birth of Germany, yet ask most people today, and they'll point to Hastings or Tours as Europe's defining medieval battles. So why does Lechfeld languish in obscurity? Partly because Otto's successors couldn't sustain his unity. The Holy Roman Empire became a byword for fragmentation. But there's another reason: the Magyars themselves. Unlike the Huns or Mongols, they didn't vanish after defeat. They settled, converted to Christianity, and became the Hungarians, a people who later wrote their own history, softening the memory of their raiding past. Here's what gets lost. Lechfeld was Europe's last stand against the steppe nomad tradition. After this, the continent's existential threats came from within: crusades, religious wars, dynastic conflicts. The battle didn't just end raids, it closed a chapter of history. Yet while French children learn of Charles Martel at Tours and the English reenact Hastings, Germany's defining victory slips through the cracks. Perhaps because nations prefer origin stories with clearer heroes and fewer contradictions. But on the windswept fields of Lechfeld, something profound was forged. Not just a kingdom, but the idea of a people bound by more than blood or tribe. And that's a battle worth remembering. The Byzantine Empire had weathered storms before Persian sieges, Arab conquests, even the humiliation at Pliska. But in the summer of 1071, near the fortress of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, it faced a reckoning that would ripple through centuries. Emperor Romanos' Roman fort Diogenes led a force of 40,000, a mix of Greek troops, Norman mercenaries, and Armenian cavalry against the Seljuk Turks under Sultan Alp Arslan. On paper, it should have been a decisive Byzantine victory. Instead, it became a catastrophe wrapped in paradox, a battle simultaneously overrated and underappreciated, its true impact obscured by both legend and neglect. The myths surrounding Manzikert start with its scale. Popular accounts paint it as a crushing defeat that single-handedly doomed Byzantium, but the reality was messier. The Byzantine army wasn't annihilated, it unraveled. Betrayal, not battlefield losses, sealed Romanos' fate. Andronicus Doukas, a rival aristocrat, spread rumors of the emperor's death mid-battle and withdrew his troops, sowing panic. Romanos, captured alive, was treated with surprising respect by Alp Arslan, who released him after negotiating a ransom. The real damage came later. Civil war erupted in Constantinople, paralyzing the empire while the Seljuks seized Anatolia practically unopposed. Yet Manzikert's fame among historians isn't entirely misplaced. It exposed Byzantium's fatal weaknesses: political fragmentation, over-reliance on mercenaries, and the erosion of its thematic military system. Without Anatolia, the empire lost its breadbasket and recruiting ground, shrinking into a Greek rump state. But here's the twist: the Seljuks didn't immediately exploit their victory. Alp Arslan cared more about fighting the Fatimids in Egypt than conquering Byzantium. The real devastation came decades later as Turkic tribes, not Seljuk armies, flooded into the vacuum. So why does Manzikert loom large in academic circles but fade in public memory? Blame the Crusades. The clash at Manzikert set the stage for Christian Europe's counterpunch. The First Crusade, a drama so epic it eclipsed its catalyst. Meanwhile, Byzantine chroniclers, eager to vilify Romanos' rivals, exaggerated the battle's decisiveness. Modern pop history, obsessed with clear turning points, reduces it to a beginning-of-the-end moment, ignoring the slow bleed that followed. The battle's true lesson isn't about one day's carnage but about structural fragility. Manzikert didn't kill Byzantium, it revealed how mortal the empire had already become. And that's why it deserves more than footnotes or oversimplified epitaphs. This was the moment the Eastern Roman Empire ceased to be a Mediterranean superpower and became something smaller, leaner, and ultimately doomed. Yet in its shadow, new worlds were born: the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the Crusader kingdoms, even the seeds of the Ottoman Empire. Few battles straddle the line between myth and reality so precariously, or hide their consequences so well. The Straits of Myeongnyong churned with the weight of impending doom on October 26, 1597. Outnumbered 10-1, with just 13 ships against a Japanese armada of 133, Korean Admiral Yi Sun-sin faced what should have been a suicide mission. His own government had nearly doomed him, stripped of rank, tortured, and demoted to a common soldier after political rivals falsely accused him of cowardice. Only desperation had forced them to reinstate him weeks earlier, with the Japanese invasion surging and Korea's navy in ruins. Yet what followed wasn't a last stand. It was a masterclass in naval warfare so brilliant it defies belief. Yi's advantage wasn't numbers, it was geography and genius. He'd studied the Myeongnyong Strait's violent tides, which reversed direction every few hours with currents strong enough to capsize ships. As the Japanese fleet advanced, he lured them into the narrows just as the tide turned. Their lead vessels, caught in the sudden pull, collided helplessly while his turtle ships, ironclad behemoths with dragon-headed cannons, held position, pounding them point-blank. The Japanese couldn't flank or retreat. Their own numbers became their downfall, ships piling up like driftwood in the choke point. By day's end, 33 Japanese ships lay at the bottom of the strait. The rest fled. Korea hadn't just survived, it had shattered Japan's naval supremacy without losing a single ship. So why does Yi Sun-sin remain a footnote outside Korea? Blame the lens of history. Western chronicles, obsessed with European conflicts like the Spanish Armada, overlooked Asia's naval dramas. Even Japan, eager to move past Hideyoshi's failed invasions, downplayed the defeat. But his legacy runs deeper than one battle. His turtle ships, centuries ahead of their time, featuring retractable spikes and multi-cannon decks, were the dreadnoughts of their age. His meticulous war diaries reveal a mind that combined Sun Tzu's cunning with Nelson's daring. The real tragedy isn't obscurity, it's the cost of his triumph. Denied reinforcements for years, he fought on alone, buying Korea time until Ming China intervened. He died in 1598 at the Battle of Noryong, shot while rallying his fleet for one final charge. Today, his statue towers over Seoul's Gwanghwamun Square, a reminder that history's greatest commanders aren't always the ones we're taught to remember. Victory against impossible odds, that's Myeongnyong, a legacy built not on numbers but on the courage to stand where others would flee, that's Yi Sun-sin. Dawn broke over Klashino on July 4, 1610, revealing a sight that should have spelled certain doom: 7,000 Polish-Lithuanian troops facing a combined Russian-Swedish force nearly 3 times their size. At the heart of this mismatch rode the winged hussars, their feathered backplates catching the first light, lances lowered like a forest of steel. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a ballet of brutality, a showcase of how disciplined cavalry could shatter the logic of numbers. By day's end, the hussars would etch their name into military legend and inadvertently set in motion the collapse of a tsardom. The battle hinged on deception and sheer audacity. Polish commander Stanislaw Zulkuski, aware his outnumbered army couldn't win a slogging match, turned the marshy terrain to his advantage. He feigned weakness, luring the Russian-Swedish forces into repeated charges that exhausted their infantry. Then, at the critical moment, the hussars struck, not head-on, but in a relentless series of flanking maneuvers. Their famed kopia lances, up to 19 feet long, punched through armor like paper, while the psychological terror of their wings, wooden frames that hummed eerily in charge, sowed panic. The Russian lines, tightly packed and poorly coordinated, collapsed inward. Swedish reinforcements arrived too late, only to be caught in the rout. Klashino's aftermath proved even more consequential than the battle itself. The victory paved the way for Polish forces to occupy Moscow, installing a puppet Tsar and deepening Russia's time of troubles, a decade of famine, civil war, and foreign intervention that nearly erased the nation from the map. Yet here's the paradox: this battle, which almost destroyed Russia, is barely whispered in its schools. Blame 19th century nationalism. As Russia rebuilt its identity after Napoleon, historians glossed over eras of humiliation, recasting the time of troubles as a patriotic crucible rather than a near-death experience. The Romanov dynasty, which emerged from the chaos, had no interest in memorializing a defeat that exposed the fragility of their predecessors' rule. What makes Klashino's erasure so ironic is how it shaped the very tactics Russia would later master. The Hussars' success, lightning strikes, feigned retreats, psychological warfare prefigured the strategies Peter the Great and Suvorov would use to build Russia's imperial might. Even the wings found an echo in the Cossack cavalry that terrified Napoleon. Yet the battle remains Poland's pride and Russia's blind spot, a reminder that history isn't just written by the victors sometimes, it's rewritten by those who can't bear to remember losing. And in that forgetting, we lose something too, the messy, inconvenient truth that even empires have moments when they hang by a thread. Kloshino was one of those threads, frayed by the wings of 1,000 hussars, its fraying ignored by the histories that followed. The cannons had barely cooled when the true weight of Vienna's liberation became clear. September 12, 1683, didn't just mark the repulse of Kara Mustafa's Ottoman army, it signaled the end of an era. For centuries, the Ottomans had been the spectre haunting Europe's dreams, their empire stretching from Algeria to the Caucasus, but Vienna broke something irreversible. This wasn't merely a failed siege, it was the moment the Ottoman tide crested and began its slow, inexorable retreat. The battle's drama, the winged hussars' charge, the starving defenders' relief, often overshadows its quieter, deeper consequences. Consider the Habsburgs. Before Vienna, they were just one among Europe's squabbling dynasties. Afterward, they became the continent's bulwark against the East. The victory supercharged their prestige, fueling a century of expansion into Hungary and the Balkans. Vienna's streets, once littered with Ottoman siege tunnels, now echoed with Baroque splendor as the Habsburgs rebuilt their capital as a statement of Christian triumph. Yet this transformation wasn't just territorial, it was cultural. The captured Ottoman tents, silks, and coffee beans sparked a fascination with the exotic that would weave itself into Viennese art and daily life. That café culture you associate with Vienna, it was born from sacks of abandoned coffee beans brewed by the very men who'd fought to keep them out. For the Ottomans, the fallout was brutal. Kara Mustafa, blamed for the disaster, was strangled with a silk cord by the Sultan's executioners, a grim symbol of an empire turning inward. The defeat exposed Ottoman military stagnation, where European armies innovated with flintlock muskets and standardized artillery. The Ottomans clung to older tactics. Over the next 2 centuries, they'd lose Budapest, Belgrade, and eventually nearly all of southeastern Europe. Vienna wasn't the cause of this decline, but it was the hinge, the battle that made Europe realize the Ottomans could be beaten. Here's what most histories miss. Vienna's aftermath reshaped religion's role in geopolitics. The Pope's alliance with Protestant Poland and Orthodox Russia to save Catholic Austria proved that faith could bridge old divides when faced with a common threat. Yet, ironically, this unity sowed the seeds of Europe's next conflicts. Habsburg dominance in the Balkans would later clash with Russian ambitions, setting the stage for the First World War. So why does Vienna's legacy get reduced to a heroic last stand? Because history loves spectacle over slow unraveling. The charge of the Hussars is cinematic, the decades-long Ottoman decline is harder to dramatize. But in the quiet after the battle, the map of Europe was redrawn. Not with a single stroke, but with the patient erosion of an empire that had once seemed unstoppable. The true lesson of Vienna isn't just how battles are won, but how their echoes linger long after the dust settles. The summer of 1709 should have been Charles XII's moment of triumph. The Swedish king, barely 27 but already a living legend, had spent a decade outmaneuvering every coalition Europe threw at him. His audacious victories at Narva and Klisow earning him the nickname, the Lion of the North. But now, deep in the Ukrainian heartland near Poltava, his luck ran dry. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, it was the violent end of Sweden's age as a great power and the explosive birth of Russia's empire. And yet, outside Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, Poltava remains oddly absent from the roll call of history's decisive clashes. Charles' fatal mistake was underestimating Peter, not just the man but the transformation he'd forced upon Russia. While the Swedes relied on disciplined lines and shock tactics that had crushed their enemies for years, Peter's rebuilt army mirrored his rebuilt nation, pragmatic, adaptable, and terrifyingly resilient. The Russians had learned from past defeats, adopting European artillery and fortification techniques while retaining the deep reserves of manpower only an autocrat could muster. At Poltava, these contrasts collided. Charles, wounded and unable to command effectively, watched as his overextended troops charged straight into Russian earthworks and massed cannon fire. The Swedes, used to routing larger but less organized foes, found themselves outgunned and surrounded. By midday, their army was a shattered remnant fleeing across the Dnieper. Poltava's immediate aftermath was stark. Charles fled to Ottoman exile, Sweden lost its Baltic Empire, and Peter cemented Russia as Europe's newest heavyweight. But the battle's deeper irony lies in how differently it's remembered. For Russians, Poltava is a cornerstone of national myth. The moment their backward kingdom proved itself on the world stage. Monuments, poems, and even an opera by Tchaikovsky enshrine it as the dawn of imperial glory. In Sweden, it's a sobering lesson in overreach, a cautionary tale taught to schoolchildren but seldom dwelled upon. So why does Poltava slip through the cracks of global memory? Partly geopolitics. Western Europe, engrossed in the War of Spanish Succession, barely noticed this Eastern drama. Later historians, dazzled by Napoleon or the World Wars, skipped past the Great Northern War as a regional affair. But Poltava's neglect is also a quirk of perspective. Unlike Waterloo or Gettysburg, it lacks a clean narrative, no noble last stands or clear moral stakes. Charles wasn't a tyrant, Peter wasn't a liberator. It was simply the day one empire fell and another rose, its significance buried under centuries of louder battles, yet Poltava's ghost still walk among us. Sweden's retreat into neutrality, Russia's relentless expansionism, even the Baltic states' modern tensions all trace lines back to those bloody fields. History may forget, but the map never lies. This was the battle that turned the North upside down, and the world barely blinked. High in the rugged hills of India's northwest frontier, a lonely signaling post stood watch over the British Empire's most volatile border. Saragar, a little more than a stone outpost with a telegraph line, was never meant to hold against an army. But on September 12, 1897, 21 Sikh soldiers of the 36th Sikh Regiment found themselves staring down a force of 10,000 Pashtun tribesmen. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a symphony of defiance, a last stand so extraordinary that today, it's still taught as the pinnacle of military courage in India. Yet outside its borders, Saragar remains a whisper, overshadowed by more familiar tales of heroism. The odds were beyond impossible. The tribesmen, seeking to overrun British forts, knew Saragar was the communication lifeline between Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan. Cut it and the garrisons would be blind, but no one expected 21 men to hold. Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, the unit's signalman, sent his final message to headquarters, enemy at the gate. Request permission to fight. The reply was blunt, permission denied, withdraw. The Sikhs looked at each other, then chose disobedience. They knew retreat meant the tribesmen would swarm the forts. So they dug in, rifles ready, knowing the decision meant death. For 7 hours they fought like men possessed. The tribesmen scaled the walls, only to be driven back by bayonets and sheer will. When the enemy set fire to the post's wooden gate, the Sikhs used the smoke as cover, picking off attackers until their ammunition ran out. Then came the final act. Sepoy Gurmukh, the last survivor, signaled Fort Lockhart one last time before charging into the fray with his saber. When relief forces arrived, they found 600 tribesmen dead around the ruins and 21 Sikhs piled where they'd made their final stand. Every single one had fought to the last breath. So why does Saragar resonate so deeply in India yet languish in obscurity elsewhere? Colonial bias plays a role. British historians often marginalized Indian contributions, reserving glory for European battles. But there's another layer. Saragar defies the tropes we associate with epic last stands. There were no grand speeches, no doomed charges. just disciplined men doing their duty with quiet, unshakable resolve. Hollywood loves the Alamo's mythic bravado. Bollywood embraces Saragar, his spiritual sacrifice. In India, it's a story of Sawa Laksi Ek Laron, one man fighting like 125,000, a creed etched into Sikh identity. Yet the battle's legacy transcends borders if only we'd listen. Saragar wasn't just bravery, it was a masterclass in tactics. Those 21 men inflicted 30-to-1 casualties, a ratio unmatched in military history. Their stand bought enough time for the forts to prepare, halting the tribal advance. Today, the British and Indian armies still teach Saragar in officer training, not just as inspiration, but as a case study in leveraging terrain, psychology, and sheer audacity. Perhaps the real tragedy isn't that Saragar is forgotten, but that we've lost its deeper lesson. In an age of instant communication and drone strikes, the idea of holding a position unto death feels archaic. But Saragar reminds us that courage isn't about winning, it's about choosing to stand when every instinct says run. 21 men looked at certain death and said, "Not today." That's not just history, it's humanity at its most raw and radiant, and that deserves to be remembered not just in India but everywhere. The dusty plains of Adwa in northern Ethiopia became the stage for one of history's most astonishing upsets on March 1, 1896. For centuries, European powers had carved up Africa with near impunity, dismissing its kingdoms as backward and disorganized. But as Italy's colonial army marched confidently toward Emperor Menelik II's forces, they were walking into a trap meticulously laid by a ruler who'd spent years preparing for this moment. The Battle of Adwa wasn't just a military clash, it was a seismic slap to colonialism's narrative of invincibility, proving that an African nation could not only resist but humiliate a European empire on the battlefield. Menelik's brilliance lay in his ability to turn Italy's arrogance against them. The Italians, convinced their modern rifles and artillery would crush what they saw as a ragtag Ethiopian force, underestimated Menelik's strategic alliances. He'd spent a decade unifying Ethiopia's fractious nobles, stockpiling arms, even purchasing rifles from Italy's own suppliers. When the Italians advanced, their maps outdated and their supply lines stretched thin, they found not a scattered militia but 80,000 disciplined troops, many armed with the same weapons as their enemies. The Ethiopian highlands, a maze of steep valleys and narrow passes, became a death trap for the invaders. Italian columns, separated in the rugged terrain, were ambushed and overwhelmed piece by piece. By midday, their general was captured, their artillery silenced, and their dreams of an African empire shattered alongside their army's remnants. Adwa's aftermath sent shockwaves across 2 continents. In Europe, Italy's government collapsed in disgrace, its colonial ambitions exposed as hollow. In Africa, the victory became a beacon proof that colonialism wasn't inevitable. Yet for decades, Western histories downplayed or outright ignored Adwa, framing it as a fluke rather than a masterstroke. Colonial archivists buried accounts of the battle, while textbooks obsessed over European conquest. Even today, ask most people to name a colonial battle, and they'll cite Isandlwana or Rorke's Drift British defeats that still fit the narrative of eventual triumph. Adwa, a complete rout where Africa dictated terms, didn't fit the script, but Ethiopia never forgot. Adwa became the cornerstone of its national identity, a symbol of resistance woven into art, music, and political discourse. When Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations against Mussolini's invasion in the 1930s, he invoked Adwa as evidence of Ethiopia's sovereignty. For Pan-African leaders like Nkrumah and Nyerere, the battle was a blueprint proof that unity and preparation could break colonialism's grip. Here's what's most striking about Adwa's legacy: it wasn't just a military victory. It was a diplomatic one. Menelik's triumph forced Italy to recognize Ethiopia's independence in the Treaty of Addis Ababa. making it the only African nation to avoid colonization during the scramble for Africa. The battle's real lesson wasn't just in muskets and mountains, but in Menelik's shrewdness playing European powers against each other, leveraging their rivalries to arm his people while they never saw the threat coming. That's why Adwa remains more than a historical footnote. It's a counter-argument to the myth of African passivity, a reminder that the continent's history isn't just one of victimhood but of agency. The echoes of those war horns at dawn still resonate, not just in Ethiopia's highlands but wherever people fight to rewrite the stories told about them. Some battles change borders, Adwa changed perceptions, and that's a victory no empire could ever erase. The frigid waters of the Tsushima Strait became the graveyard of imperial ambition on May 27, 1905. For 7,000 Russian sailors aboard the Baltic Fleet, their 18,000-mile voyage halfway around the world ended in a cataclysm of steel and fire. Japan's Admiral Togo Hayakairo had spent months preparing for this moment, drilling his crews until their movements were instinctive, while the exhausted Russians lumbered into his trap with coal shortages and mutinous crews. What unfolded wasn't just a naval battle, it was the death knell for one empire and the explosive debut of another, a clash whose shockwaves would ripple through 2 world wars and beyond. Togo's strategy was as elegant as it was brutal. Stationed near the Korean peninsula, he'd studied the Russians' predictable route like a chess master anticipating an opponent's blunder. As the Russian fleet straggled single file through the strait, Togo executed the crossing the T maneuver with flawless precision, a tactic theorized for decades but never before deployed with such devastating effect. His battleships turned in unison, raking the Russian line with concentrated broadsides while their own guns could barely reply. Within hours, 21 Russian ships, including 8 battleships, were sunk or captured. The survivors limped toward Vladivostok, only to be hunted down like wounded prey. Of 38 Russian vessels that entered the strait, only 3 escaped destruction. Tsushima's immediate consequences were seismic. For Russia, the humiliation fueled revolutionary fervor back home, hastening the fall of the Romanovs. Japan, meanwhile, announced itself as Asia's first modern naval power, shattering the myth of European invincibility. But the battle's deeper legacy lies in the arms race it triggered. Britain, stunned by Japan's efficiency, rushed to build dreadnoughts, while Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm Roman II, obsessed with matching Togo's new naval warfare, accelerated his fleet expansion. The ripple effects reached Washington, where American strategists began drafting War Plan Orange, anticipating conflict with Japan decades before Pearl Harbor. Yet post-war histories often sideline Tsushima, treating it as a regional curiosity rather than the global pivot it was. Blame the 20th century's larger conflicts. World War I's trenches and World War II's carriers overshadowed this earlier drama. But there's another uncomfortable reason. Tsushima didn't fit the colonial narrative. A non-European nation dominating at sea, Western powers preferred to remember Trafalgar or Jutland, victories that reinforced their own myths. The real tragedy of Tsushima's obscurity is how its lessons were ignored. Togo proved that training and technology could trump raw firepower, a lesson Germany and Japan would relearn painfully in 1945. The battle's ghosts still haunt naval academies, whispering warnings about overconfidence and the high cost of unpreparedness. Some victories change battles. Tsushima changed the world, then slipped quietly into history's shadows, waiting to be rediscovered. The summer of 1914 was meant to be Austria-Hungary's reckoning with Serbia, a swift, brutal punishment for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But on the rugged slopes of Sur Mountain, just weeks into the Great War, something extraordinary happened. The Austro-Hungarian army, one of Europe's most formidable forces, stumbled into a bloodbath of their own making, outmaneuvered by a smaller, scrappier Serbian force. This wasn't just the first Allied victory of World War I. It was a punch thrown so hard it rattled the confidence of an empire, and then, inexplicably, faded from the war's dominant narratives. Austria-Hungary's blunders began before the first shot. Convinced the Serbs would collapse under sheer imperial might, they rushed into battle with outdated maps, underestimating the terrain's brutality. Sur Mountain wasn't just hilly, it was a maze of dense forests, steep ravines, and narrow trails that neutralized Austria's artillery advantage. Meanwhile, Serbian Field Marshal Stepanovic turned the land itself into a weapon. His troops, many hardened by the Balkan Wars, knew every ridge and gully. They let the Austrians advance into killing zones, then struck from the flanks with a ferocity that shocked their enemies. By August 24th, the Austro-Hungarian 5th and 6th Armies were in full retreat, leaving behind 30,000 casualties, 6 times Serbia's losses. But Sir's significance wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. For Serbia, the victory became a rallying cry, proof that a small nation could defy a giant. Crowds in Belgrade cheered as captured Austrian helmets were paraded through the streets, and volunteers flocked to the army. Yet this morale boost came at a cruel cost. The battle drained Serbia's already scarce ammunition and medical supplies, setting the stage for the horrific privations that would follow when Austria-Hungary returned with German reinforcements the next year. So why does Ser get overshadowed by the Western Front's stalemates? Partly because of how the war unfolded. The trenches of France and Flanders dominated headlines, their grinding horrors symbolizing the war's futility for British and French audiences. Ser, by contrast, was a messy, mobile battle in a region few in Western Europe understood. Even Austria-Hungary's own propaganda downplayed the defeat, fearing it would embolden other restive parts of their empire. The deeper irony is how Ser foreshadowed the war's future. It exposed the fatal flaws of old-world armies' rigid hierarchies, inflexible tactics that would soon doom millions on the Western Front. Serbia's victory, though fleeting, was a glimpse of how adaptability and local knowledge could trump sheer firepower. Yet history's spotlight stayed fixed on the Somme and Verdun, battles that fit the narrative of industrialized slaughter. Ser's story of underdogs buying time against impossible odds got lost in the shadows of grander, grimmer tales. Perhaps that's the battle's real lesson: victories don't always shape memory. Sometimes they're swallowed by the tides of tragedy that follow. But for a brief, brilliant moment in 1914, a mountain in Serbia proved that even empires could bleed. And that's a story worth pulling back into the light. Warsaw burned with desperation in August 1920. The newly reborn Polish state, barely 2 years old after a century of partitions and foreign rule, faced annihilation as the Soviet Red Army surged toward its capital. 500,000 Bolshevik troops under Mikhail Tukhachevsky stood ready to crush Poland, then pour revolution into Germany and beyond, Lenin's dream of a communist Europe within reach. But over 3 days near the Vistula River, Polish forces under Joseph Pilsudski pulled off what history would call the miracle on the Vistula, a lightning counterstroke that didn't just save Poland, it altered the trajectory of 20th century Europe. The battle was a masterclass in deception. Pilsudski, a former revolutionary turned statesman, feigned retreat from Warsaw, drawing Tukhachevsky's overextended armies into a trap. While Polish radio broadcast panic to sell the ruse, Pilsudski secretly massed reserves south of the city. On August 16th, his forces struck like a hammer against the Soviet flank, slicing their supply lines and collapsing their advance. The Red Army, crippled by overconfidence and stretched communications, unraveled into chaos. Within a week, what began as Moscow's triumphant march became a rout so complete that Lenin later called it an enormous defeat, one that forced the Soviets to accept Poland's independence in the Treaty of Riga. Yet for a victory that arguably delayed communist expansion for decades, Warsaw's battle remains curiously absent from Western classrooms. The reasons are steeped in Cold War politics. After World War II, Poland fell into the Soviet sphere, and Western historians, eager to foster détente, downplayed conflicts that painted the USSR as an aggressor. Textbooks framed communism's spread as inevitable, ignoring Warsaw as an inconvenient hiccup. Even Churchill, who called the battle one of the most decisive in history, later admitted allies had forgotten its significance under pressure to cooperate with Stalin. The battle's erasure also stems from fractured narratives. Polish émigrés celebrated it as a national epic, while Soviet propagandists recast it as a minor setback against White Poland. Without a clear villain or simple moral, unlike Normandy or Stalingrad, Warsham's complexity made it a poor fit for post-war myth-making. But beneath the politics lies a deeper irony. Pilsudski's victory didn't just preserve Poland. It bought Europe time. Had the Red Army reached Germany in 1920, a weakened Weimar Republic might have succumbed to communist uprisings, reshaping World War II's entire calculus. Today, Warsaw stands as a testament to history's selective memory, a battle too consequential to ignore, yet too tangled to simplify. It reminds us that victories aren't just won on battlefields, but in the stories we choose to tell. And sometimes the most pivotal moments are the ones left out of the telling. The vast Mongolian steppe seemed an unlikely stage for a battle that would quietly reshape the Second World War. But in the summer of 1939, the remote Kholkhin-Gol River became the crucible where Soviet and Japanese ambitions collided. While Europe teetered on the brink of war, this obscure border conflict between Stalin's Red Army and Imperial Japan's Kwantung Army escalated into a brutal 5-month duel of armor and tactics. By the time the dust settled, the clash had not only redefined Asia's military balance, it had sent Tokyo's war planners scrambling to revise their entire strategy, with consequences that echoed all the way to Pearl Harbor. What began as a minor skirmish over disputed territory spiraled into a full-scale test of strength thanks to mutual miscalculation. Japan, already mired in its war with China, saw an opportunity to probe Soviet defenses in Mongolia, hoping to secure its northern flank. But Stalin, paranoid after purging his own officer corps, interpreted the incursion as a direct threat. He dispatched a little-known general named Georgy Zhukov with a simple order: crush the invaders no matter the cost. Zhukov, sensing his chance to prove himself, transformed Kholkhin-Gol into a laboratory for modern warfare. He massed tanks, artillery, and aircraft with precision unseen in previous Soviet campaigns, while Japanese commanders, clinging to Bushido ideals, dismissed the notion that backward Russian forces could outmaneuver them. The result was a masterclass in combined arms tactics. Zhukov lured Japanese units into a trap, feigning weakness before encircling them with a devastating pincer movement. His use of air power to disrupt supply lines and coordinated tank assaults shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility on land. When the smoke cleared, Japan had suffered over 20,000 casualties, their worst military defeat since the Russo-Japanese War. The humiliation forced Tokyo to abandon its ambitions northward, pivoting instead toward Southeast Asia and the Pacific, a decision that would eventually pit them against the United States. Yet Kholkhin-Gol's secrecy is as intriguing as its outcome. Stalin, unwilling to advertise the purge weakened Red Army's vulnerabilities, downplayed the victory domestically. Japan, equally embarrassed, buried reports of the disaster. Western observers, fixated on Hitler's march into Poland, barely noticed, but the battle's ghosts lingered. Zhukov's triumph earned him Stalin's trust, setting the stage for his pivotal role in defending Moscow 2 years later. Meanwhile, Japan's crushed Kwantung Army leadership was quietly reassigned, some to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, their failure at Kholkhin-Gol forever shaping their approach to confronting industrial powers. The real tragedy of Kholkhin-Gol's obscurity lies in the warnings it offered, and how few heeded them. The battle proved that industrialized warfare favored logistics and flexibility over blind courage, a lesson Japan would relearn painfully at Midway and Guadalcanal. It revealed Stalin's willingness to sacrifice men for political gains, foreshadowing the brutality of the Eastern Front. Most crucially, it demonstrated how small conflicts in forgotten corners of the world could ripple into global cataclysms. History remembers the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed that same summer, but it was Köln-Gol that quietly set the Pacific ablaze. Some battles don't just fade from memory, they smolder beneath it, waiting to ignite the stories we think we know. While the world's attention in June 1944 was fixed on Normandy's beaches, another D-Day was unfolding 8,000 kilometers to the east, one just as desperate, just as pivotal, yet all but erased from popular memory. The twin battles of Imphal and Kohima, fought in the treacherous jungles of Burma, marked Britain's last stand in Asia and shattered Japan's myth of invincibility in the most brutal campaign of the Far Eastern War. This wasn't just a fight for territory, it was a battle of survival where monsoon rains, dysentery, and sheer willpower determined the outcome as much as bullets. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Japan's 15th Army, fueled by dreams of invading India and inciting rebellion against British rule, launched Operation Yugo, a massive offensive through the Naga Hills. Their target, the strategic hubs of Imphal and Kohima, gateways to the plains of Assam. But what Japanese commanders envisioned as a swift victory turned into a nightmare of their own making. British and Indian forces, alongside fierce Naga tribesmen, transformed the jungle into a lethal maze of ambushes and fortified ridges. At Kohima, the fighting became so close quarters that opposing trenches were dug mere meters apart, with soldiers hurling insults and grenades across a battered tennis court that became known as the Stalingrad of the East. What made Imphal Kohima extraordinary wasn't just the defiance of the defenders but the logistical ingenuity that kept them alive. As Japanese supply lines stretched to breaking point, British General William Slim orchestrated an epic airlift, flying in reinforcements, ammunition, and even mules through monsoons that grounded all but the most determined pilots. Meanwhile, Japanese troops, cut off and starving, resorted to eating roots and leather, a harrowing preview of the attrition that would doom their Pacific campaign. By July, the once proud 15th Army was a shattered force with 50,000 dead or wounded. Yet this triumph remains overshadowed by Normandy's glamour and the Pacific's island-hopping drama. Blame geography and narrative bias. Southeast Asia lacked the clear moral stakes of Europe or the dramatic visuals of Iwo Jima's flag-raising. But there's another reason: colonial discomfort. Britain's victory relied heavily on Indian and Gurkha troops, soldiers whose post-war demands for independence complicated the battle's celebratory retelling. The battle's true legacy lies in its foreshadowing. Imphal Kohima proved that jungle warfare demanded more than brute force. It required adaptability, respect for local knowledge, and air supremacy, lessons America would relearn painfully in Vietnam. It also marked the birth of modern Indian military pride, with veterans of these battles later forming the backbone of India's post-independence army. History may forget battles that don't fit tidy narratives, but the echoes of Imphal Kohima linger, in the rusted helmets still unearthed in Naga villages, in the stubborn pride of those who fought there, and in the quiet truth that sometimes the most decisive battles are the ones fought furthest from the spotlight. The guns had barely fallen silent in the jungles of Dien Bien Phu when the shockwaves began radiating far beyond Vietnam's borders. France's catastrophic defeat in May 1954 wasn't just a military failure. It was a detonator that blew apart the myth of European colonial invulnerability. The sight of bedraggled French paratroopers surrendering to Ho Chi Minh's guerrillas sent an unmistakable signal to every independence movement from Algiers to Jakarta: empires could be broken. Algeria's National Liberation Front seized the moment with brutal clarity. Just months after Dien Bien Phu, they launched their own insurgency, applying General Diop's playbook of asymmetric warfare to the streets of Algiers and the Atlas Mountains. French commanders, still reeling from Indochina's trauma, found themselves fighting ghosts, phantom enemies who melted into civilian populations just as the Viet Minh had. The psychological impact was devastating. Every ambush, every bombing in Algeria carried the echo of Dien Bien Phu's trenches, eroding French morale until even the most hardened colonialists questioned whether the cost was worth paying. By 1962, France would abandon Algeria too, its empire reduced to fragments, but the battle's ripple effects reached far beyond former colonies. In Washington and Moscow, strategists pored over maps with fresh urgency. The Eisenhower administration, terrified of dominoes toppling across Southeast Asia, doubled down on supporting anti-communist regimes, a policy that would soon entangle America in Vietnam. Meanwhile, Soviet military academies added Dien Bien Phu to their curricula, studying how peasant armies could outmaneuver industrialized powers. Castro's rebels in Cuba took notes. Che Guevara would later call Giap's victory a beacon for all revolutionaries. Perhaps most ironically, the battle reshaped the very superpowers that sought to control its aftermath. France's humiliation accelerated European integration as Paris sought new influence through the European Economic Community rather than colonies. The United States, underestimating Dien Bien Phu's lessons, stumbled into its own quagmire in Vietnam a decade later. Even China, which had supplied the Viet Minh, found itself caught between celebrating a communist victory and fearing a neighbor strengthened by war. Dien Bien Phu's true legacy isn't just in the trenches that still scar that valley. It's in the unspoken rule it etched into global politics, that no amount of technology or firepower can substitute for the will of people fighting for their land. The battle didn't just end a war, it changed the rules of the game, forcing empires and superpowers alike to confront a world where determination could outgun dreadnoughts. And that's a lesson we're still reckoning with today. The dusty plains of Punjab became an armored inferno in September 1965, as nearly 1,000 tanks, Indian Centurions and Pakistani Pattons clashed near the tiny village of Chawinda. This was no border skirmish. It was the largest concentration of tanks in battle since Kursk in 1943, a thunderous duel of steel that would decide the fate of Kashmir and redefine warfare in South Asia. Yet for all its scale and fury, Chawinda remains a ghost in military history, overshadowed by Vietnam and the Cold War's flashpoints. India's strategy hinged on sheer momentum. Their first armored division, veterans of World War II, planned to punch through Pakistan's defenses and race toward the strategic city of Sialkot. But Pakistani commanders, tipped off by intercepted radio chatter, transformed Chawinda into a killing field. They dug their Pattons into camouflaged positions, using sugarcane fields and irrigation ditches as natural cover, while Indian tanks rolled straight into their gun sights. The result was carnage. By the third day, the battlefield resembled a graveyard of burning hulls, with both sides losing hundreds of vehicles. Yet neither could claim a clean victory, just a brutal stalemate that left the front lines nearly unchanged. What makes Chawinda's erasure so puzzling isn't just its scale, but its revelations. This was the first major test of Western and Soviet tanks in direct combat, a proxy war masquerading as a regional conflict. American-made Pakistani Pattons, touted as superior, suffered catastrophic ammunition fires when hit, a flaw the U.S. would later confront in Vietnam. Meanwhile, India's British Centurions proved remarkably resilient, shaping global tank design for decades. These lessons should have echoed through military academies, yet Cold War geopolitics muffled them. Western journalists fixated on Cuba and Berlin, while both India and Pakistan, eager to downplay losses, obscured the battle's intensity. The battle's true legacy lies in its ghost. Chawinda forced both nations to confront the limits of armored warfare in the missile age, foreshadowing the shift toward mobile defenses and anti-tank helicopters. It also birthed South Asia's nuclear obsession. Both countries, realizing conventional war led only to bloody deadlock, raced to develop atomic weapons as the ultimate deterrent. Today, the fields near Chawinda are quiet, the rusted wrecks long cleared, but the silence speaks volumes. Some battles don't just fade from history, they haunt it, their lessons unlearned until the ground trembles again. The streets of Mogadishu were still smoking when the aftershocks began. The Battle of Mogadishu in October 1993, immortalized as Black Hawk Down, wasn't just a firefight, it was a reckoning. 18 American soldiers dead, 73 wounded, and 2 Black Hawk helicopters reduced to scrap metal in a maze of alleys teeming with militia fighters. But the true impact wasn't measured in body counts or burning wreckage, it was in the seismic shifts this single battle triggered in how superpowers wage war and when they choose not to. For the United States, Mogadishu became a cautionary tale written in blood. The mission, designed as a swift snatch and grab to capture warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid's lieutenants, spiraled into a 19-hour siege where Delta Force operators and Rangers fought back-to-back against thousands of armed Somalis. The images are dead American pilot dragged through the streets, Humvees reduced to bullet-riddled husks aired globally, igniting a political firestorm. Within weeks, President Clinton ordered a full withdrawal, shelving plans for future humanitarian interventions. The message was unmistakable. The American public had no stomach for messy, open-ended conflicts where victory had no clear definition. This retreat didn't just end operations in Somalia. It cast a long shadow over Rwanda a year later when the specter of another Mogadishu contributed to the world's indifference as genocide unfolded. Yet even as policymakers retreated, military strategists leaned in. Mogadishu forced a brutal reassessment of urban combat. The raid exposed fatal flaws, inadequate armor for ground troops, over-reliance on helicopter support in dense urban canyons, and intelligence gaps that turned a simple operation into a trap. The lessons were etched into doctrine. Within years, the U.S. military invested in lightweight body armor, up-armored vehicles like the MRAP, and precision close air support innovations that would later define operations in Fallujah and Mosul. Special Forces training drills now simulate Mogadishu moments, stressing contingency planning for when technology fails and chaos takes over. The battle's cultural footprint runs deeper still. Black Hawk Down, the film distilled the chaos into a 2-hour narrative, but reality was far messier. Somali civilians caught in crossfire or deliberately used as human shields by Aidid's forces bore the brunt, with estimates of 1,000 dead. This moral ambiguity forced Western militaries to grapple with a haunting question: how to wage war in cities where combatants and civilians are indistinguishable. The answer, still evolving today, shapes everything from drone strike protocols to rules of engagement in Gaza and Kyiv. Mogadishu's legacy isn't just in what changed, but in what endures. It proved that even the mightiest military can be humbled by terrain as simple as a dusty street, and that the will of a local populace, armed with little more than rifles and rage, can outlast satellite-guided might. Most crucially, it taught the 21st century's hardest lesson. In an age of asymmetric warfare, victory isn't about holding ground, it's about surviving the story that follows. And sometimes the battles we lose echo loudest. For 4 years, the streets of Sarajevo became a cruel experiment in endurance. The siege of Sarajevo wasn't just a military blockade, it was a systematic dismantling of normalcy, where snipers hid in hillsides to pick off children fetching water, where bread lines turned into killing fields, and where a single stretch of pavement, nicknamed Sniper Alley, became a gauntlet of terror. From April 1992 to February 1996, the Bosnian capital lived under the longest siege of a modern city, a relentless assault that starved its people not just of food but of hope. And yet, ask most people today to name a siege, and they'll recall Leningrad or Stalingrad, never Sarajevo. Why does this tragedy, so recent and so brutal, slip into the shadows of history? The siege was a war of invisible borders and psychological torment. Serbian forces perched in the surrounding mountains didn't need to storm the city, they choked it. With artillery emplacements and sniper nests, they turned daily life into a lethal lottery. A grandmother hanging laundry on her balcony could be cut down by a single bullet. A tram packed with commuters might vanish in the flash of a mortar shell. The cruelty was methodical, designed to erode the spirit as much as the body. Yet Sarajevo's defiance became legendary. Musicians staged concerts in bombed-out buildings, actors performed in blacked-out theaters, and journalists like Zora Dejerlik broadcasted from a makeshift radio station, her voice threading through the darkness to remind the city it wasn't alone. Here's the bitter irony: Sarajevo's suffering unfolded on live television, yet never seared itself into global memory the way later Middle Eastern conflicts would. Camera crews filmed the carnage, reporters chronicled the starvation, yet the world responded with half-measures, airlifts that couldn't meet the need, peacekeepers who couldn't return fire. Compare this to the outrage over Aleppo or Gaza, and the disparity is stark. Perhaps it was timing. The siege coincided with the dizzying optimism of the post-Cold War 90s, an era unwilling to confront Europe's own savagery. Or perhaps it was the uncomfortable truth that Sarajevo's tormentors weren't foreign extremists, but neighbors, former classmates, even friends. The Balkan Wars forced the West to acknowledge that ethnic hatred wasn't confined to distant deserts, it festered in the heart of their own continent. The siege legacy lingers in the scars of the city and the silence of history books. When the guns finally fell silent, over 11,000 Sarajevans lay dead, half of them civilians. The Dayton Accords ended the war but froze the divides, leaving a city forever altered. Walk Sarajevo today and you'll see roses. Red resin poured into mortar scars in the pavement, marking where bombs fell. They call them Sarajevo roses, fleeting memorials that fade with time, just like the world's memory of what happened here. The siege taught us how easily civilization unravels, how quickly a multicultural city can be torn apart by those who profit from division. And that's why it frightens us, because Sarajevo wasn't ancient history. It was yesterday, and if it happened there, it could happen anywhere. The dusty plains of Angola became an unlikely turning point in the struggle against apartheid, a forgotten battlefield where Cold War tensions, African liberation dreams, and the last gasps of colonial power collided with earth-shaking consequences. The Battle of Cuito-Cuanavale, a sprawling, months-long siege in 1987 and 88, pitted Cuba's Revolutionary Army and Angolan government forces against South Africa's apartheid-era military and their rebel allies. This wasn't just a regional conflict, it was the climax of a decades-long shadow war, one where victory didn't just change borders, but altered the moral calculus of an entire continent. South Africa's involvement was never officially acknowledged. Their elite forces, armed with cutting-edge Mirage jets and Oliphant tanks, operated under the guise of supporting UNITA rebels, masking apartheid's desperate bid to maintain regional dominance. The prize, control of Cuito-Cuanavale, a strategic river town that could open the path to Angola's diamond-rich interior. But standing in their way was an unexpected adversary, Cuba's Fidel Castro, who had deployed 50,000 troops to Angola not just as Soviet proxies but as committed revolutionaries. For Castro, this was about more than Cold War chess. It was a chance to strike a blow against white minority rule itself. The battle unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche. South African forces, overconfident after years of crushing poorly equipped guerrillas, found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition against Cuban artillery and Angolan resilience. The siege dragged for months, with both sides pouring in reinforcements across unforgiving terrain. Cuban pilots flew daring sorties in aging MiGs against South Africa's technologically superior air force, while Angolan civilians dug trenches under bombardment. By early 1988, the stalemate had become a symbol proof that apartheid's military machine wasn't invincible. Unveil's true impact rippled far beyond the battlefield. The conflict forced South Africa to the negotiating table, draining its resources and exposing the futility of its regional ambitions. Within a year, Pretoria agreed to withdraw from Angola and grant independence to Namibia, a key step in dismantling apartheid's buffer states. Nelson Mandela, still imprisoned on Robben Island, later called the battle the turning point for the liberation of our continent, a sentiment echoed by black communities across southern Africa who saw Cuba's intervention as solidarity, not Soviet puppetry. Yet this pivotal clash remains oddly absent from mainstream Cold War narratives. Western historians, fixated on Berlin or Cuba, often dismiss it as a peripheral skirmish, while post-apartheid South Africa downplayed its significance to foster reconciliation. Even Cuba's role gets oversimplified, framed as mere Soviet pawns rather than ideologues who saw themselves as heirs to Che Guevara's anti-colonial legacy. The battle's silencing speaks volumes about who gets to write history. Unveil wasn't just about tanks and trenches, it was about rewriting the rules of power. When Cuban and Angolan troops finally broke the siege, they didn't just win a battle, they shattered the myth of white invincibility that had propped up apartheid for generations. And in that victory, half a world away from Washington and Moscow, the 20th century's last great liberation struggle found its unlikely fulcrum. Some battles don't just end wars, they end eras, and sometimes the most decisive fights are the ones history tries hardest to forget. The mountains of Tora Bora loomed like a fortress of stone and ice in December 2001, their labyrinthine caves and sheer cliffs offering the perfect refuge for a man the world was desperate to find. Just months after the horror of 9/11, America had its chance to deliver justice, or so it seemed. The Battle of Tora Bora was meant to be the climax of the West's retaliation, a final siege to root out Osama bin Laden and crush al-Qaeda's leadership in their Afghan stronghold. Instead, it became a ghost story, a murky, half-fought engagement shrouded in missed opportunities and whispered what-ifs. Unlike the surgical precision of the later Abbottabad raid, Tora Bora was chaos incarnate. CIA operatives and special forces teams, stretched thin across the rugged terrain, relied heavily on Afghan militia allies of questionable loyalty. The plan was simple: pin al-Qaeda against the Pakistani border with airstrikes and ground assaults. But the execution unraveled almost immediately. Poor intelligence underestimated bin Laden's forces, while political hesitation delayed the deployment of U.S. Marines who might have sealed the escape routes. By the time the bombing raid subsided, the trail had gone cold. Some claimed bin Laden fled on horseback, others insisted he'd paid off local warlords for safe passage. The only certainty, he'd slipped through the net, vanishing into Pakistan's tribal badlands for another decade. What makes Tora Bora's obscurity so jarring is how it contrasts with the myth-making around later operations. Abbottabad's moonlit raid was immortalized in films and headlines, a clean narrative of vengeance served. Tora Bora, by comparison, lingers in the shadows, a messy, uncomfortable reminder of early miscalculations. Part of this erasure stems from sheer frustration. For years, military analysts and journalists treated the battle as a taboo, a misstep too embarrassing to dwell on. Even declassified documents read like patchwork, with critical details still redacted. But there's a deeper lesson buried in Tora Bora's fog. The battle exposed the limits of remote warfare, revealing how over-reliance on airstrikes and proxies could backfire in complex terrain. It also foreshadowed the bitter irony of the war on terror, that the pursuit of one man would sprawl into a 20-year conflict, its costs measured in trillions of dollars and countless lives. The drones and satellites that failed to track bin Laden in 2001 would later become ubiquitous, yet Tora Bora remains the original sin, the moment the hunt began to slip into quagmire. History prefers tidy endings, but Tora Bora refuses to comply. Its legacy isn't in the explosions or the body counts, but in the questions left hanging. What if more troops had been committed? What if trust hadn't been placed in unreliable allies? And most haunting of all, how many lives might have been saved if the story had ended there, in those frozen caves, instead of echoing through the years? The battle's silence speaks volumes. Some defeats aren't marked by retreat, but by the quiet recognition that the war has only just begun. The sprawling steel mills of Azovstal became the unlikely Alamo of the 21st century, a modern siege played out in real time on our smartphones. In the spring of 2022, as Russian forces tightened their grip on Mariupol, Ukraine's 36th Marine Brigade and the controversial Azov Regiment retreated into the labyrinthine complex, a network of bunkers, tunnels, and blast furnaces designed to survive nuclear war. What followed wasn't just a military engagement. It was a primal test of endurance where soldiers fought beneath 10-meter-thick concrete ceilings while the world watched through grainy telegram live streams. For 82 days, against artillery barrages, thermobaric bombs, and near-total encirclement, these defenders turned an industrial relic into a symbol of resistance, proving that even in the age of hypersonic missiles, sheer human stubbornness could still defy overwhelming firepower. Yet Mariupol's struggle for recognition began even before the last stand ended. Modern conflicts produce too many battles too quickly, their narratives drowned in the ceaseless churn of headlines. Unlike Waterloo or Gettysburg, etched into memory by decades of retrospect, today's clashes compete for attention in a world already numb to spectacle. Consider the irony. Azovstal's defenders documented their ordeal minute-by-minute pleas for evacuation scrawled on cardboard, surgeons operating by flashlight, yet this very immediacy may have robbed the battle of the mythic weight history reserves for events viewed through the softening lens of time. When suffering is live-streamed, it becomes both too visceral to ignore and too raw to memorialize. The politics of memory play their part too. Battles need champions to cement their legacy, and Mariupol's defenders carried complicated baggage. The Azov Regiment, with its far-right origins, became a PR liability even as its fighters held the line. Western media tiptoed around their heroism, while Russian propaganda exploited their presence to frame the siege as a denazification operation. Contrast this with the Warsaw Uprising or the Battle of Britain, where moral clarity let posterity polish their stories into gleaming legend. Mariupol's truth remains contested, its heroes imperfect, and history prefers saints to ambiguous martyrs. Perhaps the deepest reason for Mariupol's elusive place in history lies in the nature of modern war itself. The siege wasn't a singular collision of armies but a slow grind of attrition, its drama diffused across weeks of rubble and rationing. There were no cavalry charges or iconic flag raisings, just pixelated clips of exhausted men sharing a single tin of food. Ancient battles had Homer to sing their tales. Mariupol has algorithm-curated TikTok compilations, its horror diluted between cat videos and cooking reels. But here's what future historians might miss if they overlook this battle. Azovstal was the first great siege of the digital age, where drones buzzed like insects through shattered corridors and defenders tweeted their own epitaphs. It redefined what resilience looks like when every basement has Wi-Fi and every act of courage comes with a view counter. Most crucially, it proved that even as warfare evolves, some truths remain eternal, that walls matter less than wills, and that freedom, once tasted, is worth fighting for in the dark. History's spotlight is fickle, shining brightly on some battles while leaving others in the shadows, not because they lacked significance, but because the storytellers had blind spots. Eurocentrism bends the lens, favoring clashes that shaped Western powers over those that redrew maps in Africa, Asia, or the Americas. Victors' narratives dominate, airbrushing inconvenient defeats or reframing them as moral victories. Even the sheer volume of human conflict means some stories get buried simply for happening too far from the chronicler's gaze. But here's the uncomfortable truth: forgetting isn't accidental. It's a choice repeated over generations by textbooks, monuments, and pop culture. Consider how easily colonial battles fade unless they fit a conqueror's glory. Adwa's triumph over Italy relegated to footnotes, while Waterloo's drama gets blockbuster treatments. Or how civil wars outside Europe, like the Taiping Rebellion with its 20 million dead, vanish behind the American Civil War's cinematic sheen. Even within nations, memory is selective. Russia hymns Stalingrad but muffles the Winter War's failures. America enshrines D-Day yet skips over the brutal reconquest of the Philippines. The patterns are clear. We remember what flatters, what simplifies, or what aligns with modern identities. But this isn't just about fairness, it's about understanding the world. Those overlooked battles aren't dusty relics, they're keys to today's tensions. The siege of Sarajevo foreshadowed the brutality of urban warfare in Aleppo. The stalemate at Chowinda explains why India and Pakistan cling to nuclear brinkmanship. Even Tora Bora's foggy lessons haunt drone campaigns in Yemen. History isn't a straight line, it's a web, and every missing thread distorts the picture. So let's rewrite the script, dive into memoirs from African warlords or Ottoman scribes. Seek out the veterans of Imphal or the grandchildren of Cuito Cuanevale's fighters. Share what you find not just in comments but in conversations, because the battles we resurrect shape the future we imagine. The past isn't settled, it's waiting, full of voices we've yet to hear. And sometimes the most powerful act isn't remembering, it's finally listening.